very conscious of the expertise in the room, so I came across this little saying. It's well known that in public relations, which is my field, that you kind of try and fake it till you make it. So bear with me while I try and do that. But so I'm not pretending to specialist expertise in emergency management, although I have published in the Australian Journal of Emergency Management. Actually, and I know many of you are from local government, on the role of local government communicators in emergency communication, because some research I did there found that when emergencies did occur, local government was not as forward as it might have been in involving their existing communication resources. I'm also very conscious that we've been hearing about the role of just ordinary people, non-experts, if you like, who can show enormous courage and strength in the face of adverse circumstances. I came across this, and positioning myself as a kind of a non-expert, the argument that the author of the paper from which the title is taken was making was that expertise can, in some circumstances, actually be a hindrance because your mind runs on rails, or tends to run on rails. That people who are not embedded in familiar or traditional frameworks can more readily see opportunities to do things differently. And I want to encourage you to think that way as we talk together. Now, I live in Orewa Beach, north of Auckland, a very lovely part of the world. You can see there's not much there in the way of hills. I live on the flat, and it's a tsunami risk zone. Very pleasant, but if we got a tsunami, we'd be in strife. Just recently, last week or so, we've had a tsunami preparation exercise, and I recall from last night, yesterday, the Minister talking about a major tsunami risk exercise that will be happening later this year. I have to say, by the way, that I don't find the wave symbol there a particularly comforting one. Looks like the wave is kind of crashing down on us. But we have these new signs on the local streets, and there was a walk that school children and others did from the flat up to the hills. My wife did the walk, and it took her about 15 minutes. But one of the things about Orewa is roughly 1 in 3 residents are getting on a bit in life. In fact, with one of the local supermarkets, they just about need a special parking area for mobility scooters. You go in the aisles and you're dodging walkers. And no, I don't have one of those, and I've got no plans to get one. In the wider Auckland region, as I say there, it's around 1 in 10. So one of the things that concerns me is what's going to happen to these guys in the event of a tsunami. Talking to a distinguished colleague just before we started this morning and saying, ideally, and what I would hope, and I'm sure what you would hope, is that beyond the first responders, beyond the people who are direct carers for these guys, there is a community responsibility for us to think about in terms of how to deal with those who are in fact less mobile, less able to get to safe places in the event of a tsunami. So we'll see how it works out. Because one of the things that a drill like the one that we had a week or so ago, it certainly does raise awareness. There were pictures in the local paper about school kids in a queue going up the hills and so on. But awareness is the poor cousin to action. So let's move on. Crises, of course, can produce emergencies and the other way around. And we're familiar with some current crises that produce local emergencies. Thank goodness this isn't something that we have to face at the moment, although I believe I'm right in saying there have been cases in Australia and elsewhere. Internationally, there's a water crisis. And just recently, a book from a former senior British military officer suggesting that within a year, NATO could be at war with Russia. Who knows whether that's a realistic scenario? I talked to a couple of people yesterday about terrorism as a threat that could produce local emergencies. And recently I've published a paper on Islamic State and their use of media. Happy to talk to any of you who are interested in that subject. We read reports about how Islamic State is being crushed in the Middle East by the coalition forces. And yet one of the things that they're very consciously seeking to do is to grow a new generation. And so if we deal with the jihadi fighters who are on the battlefield right now, in the future we may have to deal with people like the little guy with the toy gun, and this guy wearing the Pakul flat-top hat as worn by Osama bin Laden, practicing beheading on a teddy bear. The jihadis believe that the very young, will be more pure fighters than they are because they've been inculcated in the ideology and the practice since birth. And I'd suggest to you that we here in New Zealand, although we're far, far from the battlefields of Syria and Iraq, cannot be complacent about the potential, even here, of facing this kind of threat. And I know some of you have been devoting thought to how that might be handled here in this country if that arises. So this is now, and this may be to come. God willing, it won't. We're aware of the basics of emergency communication, including the things that I've listed there. Excuse me. But I titled this Rethinking, so what do we need to rethink? The first thing I want to talk to you about is what I've called a push orientation. Traditionally, people in my discipline of public relations, and I was a journalist before I was a PR person, people in the field of emergency management and elsewhere have had the idea that what we need to do, what our communication job is about, is pushing information to the people who need to receive it. I talked a week or so ago to the principal of a public relations firm here in Wellington, and he was shaking his head and saying, my clients still want me just to shove material out there even though they know it's not going to really work. And although we might intellectually recognise that just pushing stuff out is no longer the way things work, yet that mindset is still so deeply embedded in us that we talk about getting a message across, which implies a kind of a one-way communication. And yet, as I'll talk to you about in a minute or two, we're dealing with an environment where people pull to themselves the information that they're looking for. Push no longer works in the way it did. The other thing I'll talk a bit more about is how we attract attention. In today's environment, in fact, I have a book called Infoglut. We face a deluge of information each and every day. Many of you have been on your phones already today, and you will have maybe checked news sites, sent emails, checked Facebook and so on. There is this deluge of information, and we have difficulty finding a path through that to reach the people that we want to influence. I also want to talk a little bit about technology integration and how we define emergency. I kind of love the quote here, Niels Bohr, the physicist, saying prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future, and we have heard some of that already, how it's about capability building, not predicting the future. One of the things that in considering communication in today's environment comes up is, if it's mobile, if it's on the go, we need to find a means of being there. I'd suggest to you that, important as that is, it's only part of, a very significant part of what we need to get to grips with. And all of us can do better in getting to grips with the world, in my case of mobile PR, and communicating with people who are on their phones all day, every day. I deal with international students who seem to be surgically attached to their phones. But there's more to it than that. In fact, one of the areas that I did my PhD on developing risk-literate public relations. And I learned as I researched for that what happens in social networks, that's you and I and others talking together, interacting together, not just social media networks, social networks, can be as powerful as the media in forging a construction of risk, a construction of an event. And so those conversations can be incredibly powerful because I'm more likely to trust you than I am something that even comes from an official source. So I've talked about the push-pull thing. And let me say again, I think we need to constantly think about the mental orientation that we have when we're planning communication. Are we simply, in effect, saying, if we build it, they will come? If we push it out, it will have an effect. No, folks, it doesn't work like that. But let me talk to you about this lovely picture of a tiger in the jungle. I want to share with you a theory called information foraging theory. This is where I guess sound a little bit like the uni lecturer I am talking about theory, but theory is basically a means of explaining something that happens. And what this is about is the idea that in digital environments, people follow strategies to get to the information or the content that they're looking for, and using pretty much the same approach that our lovely tiger there takes to look for its lunch. The tiger going through the jungle is going to look for a scent. She or he is going to look for cues in the environment. Similarly, people in digital environments are looking for an information scent. Like the tiger, they make calculated decisions as to which path through the digital jungle is most likely to lead them to the content that they wish to find. And they make calculated decisions based on economizing their energy. So which is the path of least resistance to the content, the food, if you like, the information prey that I want to consume. It's called information foraging. And it has implications for the way that we construct our presence and our content in digital environments, whether those are social media environments or other forms of digital engagement. I have to say I liked this little cartoon there. So one of the things that I've suggested to my public relations colleagues when we think about the pull environment that we're in is that maybe part of our job is laying an information trail that will draw people towards the content that we want them to consume. That doesn't mean that all we're about is producing little chunks of what the marketers call snackable content. But it does mean that we have to think about how we can lead people towards what we want them to get a hold of, not limit our thinking to pushing material out. Now, some of you may have seen the research that Microsoft Canada produced last year, suggesting that in digital environments, people's attention span had gone down from about 12 seconds in 2010 to around 8.25 seconds in 2013, roughly 3/4 of a second less than that of the average goldfish, which is why the little goldfish image there. Don't ask me how they worked out the attention span of a goldfish. Apparently, by the way, just to drop into your next cocktail conversation, a goldfish can only remember something for roughly 3 seconds. Now, I've done presentations and talks to public relations audiences around how can public relations grab attention in the 8-second gap. Frankly, I don't care much whether it's 8 seconds or 8 minutes. What seems to me to be inarguable is that digital engagement is changing people's attention spans. There's a corollary, by the way, which is actually for certain people in digital environments, they are getting better at information processing in short bursts of high attention. One of the answers that I've been promoting to people in talking about this challenge, because it is a serious challenge, is greater use of visual communication. I met earlier in the week with the head of the corporate affairs department of a major national organisation who has a communications team or a corporate affairs team of 21. One person is devoted entirely, full-time, to producing infographics. And to me, that was a significant piece of information because he was recognising, has recognised, and he said this has only happened in the last couple of years, the importance of something called the picture superiority effect. You'll have all heard versions of this. You show people a piece of text, and after 72 hours, they'll recall only 10% of what you've shown them. If you show them relevant text and a relevant image, 72 hours later, they'll recall 65% of it. I maintain an interest in the Middle East, and here is somebody in grave distress after his neighbourhood in Syria was subjected to barrel bombing. Take away the words. You don't need words to say that this person is in deep distress. We can process that image in seconds. Greater use of visual communication is important in our field as well. Storytelling, we've heard a little bit about this. I've been talking recently to people who work in the issues and crisis and risk areas of public relations. One of them said to me, I do a lot of work in handling crises and advising people on crises, but I'm having trouble getting people to kind of get their heads around what I'm on about. And I suggested to him that one of the things that he could do is think of some short stories summing up some of his experience and how it could relate to the people that he's talking to. Do you know that if you show people PowerPoints like this, and you've only got text on the slides. People's mental capacities will be devoted to reading and interpreting the words on the screen. But if you tell them a story as you do, a thing called neural coupling takes place. It actually activates a different part of the brain, and you get much greater engagement, because what people do is, first of all, they start trolling through their memories. Have I been through a similar experience, or do I know someone who's been through a similar experience? And if not, they are entering into the world that you are creating with their story, with your story. Stories, therefore, are incredibly important, but they need to be ones that can go through this cycle very quickly because of the limited attention spans that people have. At the campus where I teach, the teaching and learning guys did some research on students' attention spans. They found that on average it was about the length of 2 music videos, and that someone like me, every 6 to 7, maybe as much as 8 minutes, needed to be taking the students to a different place. So that's a challenge for people like me. Later this morning, we're going to be hearing about media. In Japan, young girls have literally rented thigh space to carry advertising messages on the basis that this is something that young men are likely to pay attention to. I kid you not. So if thigh space can be a medium for communicating a message, what do we call media now? So when we think about the media, even when we blame the media for getting it wrong, just think about that. Almost anything can be a medium now. One of the things I mentioned to you, I've done some work on Islamic State and the use of media. And typically when people talk about that, they talk about the sophistication, and indeed it is very sophisticated. But their key competence that they've demonstrated over and over again is their ability to integrate a range of communication platforms to support some fairly consistent messaging. In the areas that they control, they use big screens in parks, billboards, baseball-style caps, information kiosks, not just the atrocity videos that we hear about here. I mentioned to you before that we needed to think more broadly about digital environments than simply social media ones. We're hearing more and more about something called the Internet of Things. The world that we're moving towards with great rapidity, where pretty much everything is connected to everything else. And we're on that journey. We are not there yet. But when you're going for a run and your sneakers are communicating to you how many calories you're burning, the distance that you've run, when your fridge is telling your supermarket that you need, another 2-litre container of milk, when you can sit in a restaurant and turn on the heaters at home via Wi-Fi, how then do we reach people? When everything is talking to everyone else, that's a challenge that I don't think anyone has yet successfully got their heads around, but it's something that we should be thinking about, including from an emergency management point of view. Now, I have to say that as a researcher, I loved this cartoon. Perspective counts. And when we're thinking about audiences, we heard from Sir Ray Avery yesterday about the importance of being what he called customer-centric. let's not assume that we understand the perspectives, the perceptions of the people that we wish to communicate with. Let's make sure that we are going out to find out what those perspectives are. I have to admit that my sector, the university sector, is very good at sitting in an office saying, let's design a new course for whoever. And we sit there, don't go out to talk to people and assume that we know best. Actually, I'm increasingly convinced that that's a highly flawed model. So when our ship, if I can call it that, hits an unseen obstacle, what can we do? Well, we still need all that we had before, the various tools and techniques that we had before. You know as well as I do that digital tools give us the ability to respond with much greater speed, and things like cell phone networks and others give us opportunities to better facilitate community preparation response. But, and I did some years ago some work around Hurricane Katrina in response to that. I've never forgotten learning as part of that work that post the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, the National Guard had to use runners to convey messages because everything else was out. Non-experts have a role I'd suggest you to play in decision making, not just in compliance, not just in being consulted. But there's something else I want to suggest to you too. When I did some work for my thesis, I read an article about people who were living in a flood risk zone in the UK. 60% of them were fully aware of the flood risk but did nothing about it. And the article concluded that the reason was what it called ontological security, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute. But it was pretty much the idea that if I'm at home, I'm safe. I used to live in the city in Queensland where this happened in 2011, Toowoomba. I've called this slide ontological insecurity. Ontological security is the idea that, hey, life should just keep going on and on and on in a reasonably stable way. We don't like change. We don't like being told to change. And yet I'd suggest to you that part of the job of emergency communication is to puncture that attitude, however we do it. This is the main street of Toowoomba, which is the second largest inland city in Australia. Flash flood, carried cars and people away, people died. Who would have thought that walking down the main street of the second largest inland city in Australia, you could face that? Happened suddenly. We need to think about ways of helping people to recognise that life won't necessarily keep on going on the rails that they've been used to. And here is a newspaper headline from that time. That'd be slightly scary, would it not? Excuse me. Actually, I must confess I couldn't find a picture of a bull shark swimming down the main street of Goodna, but I did find this one from a similar event in Florida. So I'm kind of photoshopping my presentation there. One of the things I'd suggest to you too is that when we think about handling emergencies and the communication that goes with them, and crises are part of what I deal with in my academic work. I teach a course on risk and crises. The crisis after the crisis can be harder to handle than the original event. This is when reputations can be made and unmade, quite apart from the human cost and dealing with all of that. So our planning needs to think not only about emergency response, but recovery from a multitude of angles, being fully aware that the way people will evaluate performance is as much on afterwards as it is on right now. I've been watching a little countdown clock here. I can see I'm within 4 minutes and 58 seconds of my time, so we're not doing too badly. Thank you very much.